Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Strength and Hormones podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Papanos, and today you're joining me for another Lowdown with Lo. This is a solo episode where we will be really going into one specific topic as it relates to women's health and hormones health. And today we are going to be talking about heavy metals and the relationship to reproductive function, hormones like our thyroid hormones and sex hormones, and what you really need to know about the ubiquitous nature of these and what we unfortunately see with patients that we work with and how common heavy metal toxicity is and the function that it has on our reproductive system. So let's get into today's episode. Now, I want to start off and just talk a little bit about what are heavy metals and where are they found. Heavy metals are something that are naturally occurring. They are in our soil, and because of that, when we grow food, they're naturally going to be present in foods, especially things like your plant products. However, there's also animal proteins that have them, such as like seafood as well. And at small enough concentrations, there's certain heavy metals that are not harmful for us. And these are even things like our common minerals that you might know of, things like iron and zinc, copper, manganese. These are minerals that are essential for hormone production. But just like with a lot of things, it's a Goldilocks situation, right? Whereas if we don't have enough, there can be problems. And if we have too much, there can also be problems. Take iron, for example. We know that an excess of iron can create oxidative stress and can drive inflammation in the body. So, yes, we want to have adequate iron levels because we need it for our hormone function and we need it for energy production. But we don't want those iron levels to get so high to where it's driving inflammation. And that's just one example. And all of these minerals really work in balance of each other. So for zinc, for example, a lot of people supplement with zinc because it is an incredible mineral for a lot of different reasons for blood sugar and testosterone levels. However, zinc does deplete copper, and copper is needed to help with iron activation. Essentially, it's kind of the control mineral for how iron works in the body. And so we want to make sure that we're always balancing our minerals and that we're not just like long-term supplementing with one individual mineral, because that can cause complications in some of these other levels. And these minerals that I just mentioned are essential for human survival. So we do need these, but at high enough concentrations, they can become toxic. There are other heavy metals, though, which is what we'll really focus on today. And these are things like arsenic, cadmium, lead, thallium, mercury. You might have heard of some of these before, and they don't serve any biological role. So, in comparison to the ones I mentioned, like iron and zinc, those we do need enough of. If we don't have enough, there's problems. But with things like arsenic, cadmium, and lead, we really don't need any in our body at all. And in small enough quantities, they can cause a lot of harm. And we're going to talk about how they do so and how they really function as endocrine disruptors in the body. We've seen in the research that cadmium, lead, mercury in particular have all been shown to exhibit endocrine disrupting properties. If you're not familiar with endocrine disrupting chemicals, I have a podcast episode that was from last season with Avery Morales. We talk about clean living, and she gets into some of the research on endocrine disrupting chemicals and where they are found. We're going to just really focus in on one type of endocrine disrupting chemicals today, which is heavy metals. But how endocrine disrupting chemicals affect our endocrine or our hormone system is that they're not like adding hormones to the pile, right? They're just impacting how those hormones work in our body. So when it comes to hormones, we make hormones, and then those hormones have to bind to receptors that are all over different areas in our body. So we've got like thyroid receptors on our ovaries, for example. We've got estrogen receptors in our breasts. And so if there are too much endocrine disrupting chemicals in the environment, then the actual levels of those important hormones like our free T3 and our estradiol that are important for regulating how these processes work becomes impacted. Think of it as like a lock and a key, right? Where essentially that hormone that's supposed to be there is the key that opens the lock. But when these endocrine disruptor chemicals come into the mix, it's like that lock gets changed, right? And that key no longer works for that lock, and things just go astray. We can't get into the house, the hormones can't get into the cells, and all of the systems that the hormones are supposed to work on just don't work as they should. And so with heavy metals, not only are they endocrine disruptors, but they also disrupt metabolic homeostasis, which essentially means that they impact the way that our metabolism works. And metabolism, I know that a lot of times we think of just like weight, but metabolism really is this term that means how our body converts the food that we eat into energy. We have to eat. So metabolism has to happen. And metabolism isn't just correlated with things like our body weight. Metabolism also, in fact, impacts things like chronic disease development, our cognitive function, insulin resistance, so many other facets. Even take PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, that is a metabolic endocrine condition. So yes, there is a hormonal component of it, but there's also a metabolic component, and heavy metals disrupt the way that your metabolism works, and they do this on a cellular level. And when this happens, when there is excess of these heavy metals, it can lead to accumulation in various tissues. Our thyroid tends to be one of the most sensitive areas in the body to heavy metals. That's likely because it's so small. Those heavy metals really have an affinity for our thyroid. I've talked about this in depth in our podcast episode that was a couple seasons ago, where I talked about how to reverse low thyroid function without pills. So you can head on over there if you want to learn more about how it impacts the thyroid specifically. But just know that heavy metals heavily impact our thyroid function, in addition to so many other things too. So, with some of the research that's been done in these areas, they've really looked at a couple of different facets of heavy metals and endocrine disrupting chemicals. And some of that research, they looked at women that are approaching menopause. And they found that the presence of these heavy metals, particularly cadmium, mercury, and arsenic, that was tested in the subject's urine, was connected, correlated significantly to low levels of anti-Müllerian hormone, or AMH. You might not be as familiar with AMH. It's not a hormone that's tested when you go get like your estrogen, progesterone levels tested. AMH, though, is generally tested if you are trying to conceive, maybe if you're trying to determine if you are in menopause, and also generally for diagnosis of PCOS, because each of these hormonal conditions can impact AMH. AMH really is a hormone that measures ovarian reserve. That's what we use it for. However, I've talked about this in previous episodes on egg quality. It's not the best. Like, you can't just take your AMH levels and say, okay, you have a low AMH, you're not going to be fertile. There are other things that impact AMH levels. It really is more isolated for treatment for IVF than for fertility treatments than it is for really understanding a woman's ovarian reserve. However, we use it as a measure of what's about going on within the ovarian environment. So it is a measure. It's not perfect, just like a lot of these things, right? But it is something that is used to correlate where are you within your reproductive lifespan. When we are born, we have the most eggs that we'll ever have. And as you age, those eggs become less and less and less. By the time you go through menopause, you don't have very many left. And that's what AMH is looking at. It's the number of eggs that are available for fertilization to be able to facilitate pregnancy or for regular menstruation. And generally with like PCOS, for example, there's generally high AMH levels. And so if you've ever had this tested before, it might feel confusing because of that. But if you want to dive into AMH more specifically, check out our egg quality episode. Another study compared infertility, and they looked at women that were having difficulty conceiving versus women that were able to get pregnant pretty easily. And what they found was that in the US, this research was done, that there was positive associations between blood concentrations of lead and cadmium, as well as infertility. So women that had lower levels of these heavy metals got pregnant faster than women that had higher levels of these. And all of these heavy metals, cadmium, lead, mercury in particular, because these are the most common, I would say, out of all of them, have been reported to exert estrogenic effects, so mimicking the effects of estrogen. And they do this by binding to those estrogen receptors. So remember how I talked about the lock and a key effect? This is really where they come into play, as they really do impact our ability for that estrogen to work in these different tissues that we need estrogen for. So now that we know about heavy metals, where do we get exposure to these, and why is this an issue? they really are something that we're exposed to all the time. They're ubiquitous. There's really no way around them. And this is how I like to look at all endocrine disruptors, is that we really can't run from these things. Like, we can do our best, we can be the most educated, we can make the best choices for us in terms of where we buy things, how we buy them, what we consume, how much of it we consume. But at the end of the day, we would drive ourselves crazy if we were trying to never consume anything that has heavy metals, never use anything that has plastics in it. Like, it's just impossible. So that's not what the goal is. And we never need to strive for perfection in any of these things. We need to do our best, educate ourselves, try to make the best choices that we can for ourselves and our family, and then ask, where do I need extra support based off knowing my own biology, or based off knowing where I live, my environment, my lifestyle, what my diet looks like? Where do I need extra support? And that's where we really highlight things within our diet more specifically, or supplementation, or lifestyle things that we do. And we'll talk about what some of those tools look like at the end of the episode. But generally speaking, we are getting most exposed to these in food and supplements. So in food, for example, we see pretty high levels of things like mercury in seafood, especially seafood that is larger. The bigger the seafood, the longer it lives, the more mercury that it naturally accumulates. In particular, tuna, swordfish, shark are problematic for these. Rice is also another problem. You might have seen before reports on baby food having high levels of arsenic in it. Brown rice is particularly problematic for arsenic. White rice also has arsenic in it. It's not quite as high as brown rice, but it's a close second. So rice is another common exposure. And with these two, it doesn't take eating very much of them. Like, half a cup of rice per day, I believe it is, already puts you over the safe levels of arsenic. So it doesn't take too much to get there. We also see this in supplements. And this is one of the issues with a lot of herbal extracts and plant components, is that when you take a plant and you concentrate it heavily to get the therapeutic values out of it, you concentrate the heavy metals along the way. There's no way to control for this. And also, I think it's important to note that buying organic doesn't change this. So sometimes organic actually makes us worse, because then there's no like modification of the soil happening. So organic does not change the heavy metal concentration. So we might see this in things like protein powders, especially vegan protein powders, especially if they're sourced from things like brown rice, because that's already a really big problem. In like greens powders, in like camu powders, which is one of my favorites, but we do need to be mindful of sourcing here. Cacao powders, dark chocolate, we've seen to be a big issue with cadmium. Dried herbs, so a lot of the herbs you buy at the grocery store. And I'm going to present to you a couple of things that Consumer Reports looked at in the last couple of years in these areas. And then also like herbal extracts, supplements. And you might, if you live in California and you've ever purchased a supplement before, you might have even seen I believe it's Prop 65 that's on there that says this supplement has been known to cause cancer. And it's like only the state of California has to list it, because the state of California has stricter standards than other states. This is controlled by the state. And that's because that supplement is exceeding the heavy metal levels that is what California has deemed to be the safest. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't take the supplement, but we might want to be mindful of like how much of it you're taking, and making sure that we have the right support in place to help us excrete these heavy metals, because there's going to be benefits of that supplement, I'm sure. We just want to offset to make sure that we're not getting into a situation of heavy metal toxicity. So Consumer Reports put out a couple reports. One of them was titled, "Your Herbs and Spices Might Contain Arsenic, Cadmium, and Lead." You can go take a look at it. It was published a couple years ago. And they looked at some of the common places people buy their herbs and spices. They looked at places like Trader Joe's, Simply Organic, which I believe is Sprouts brand, Whole Foods Market brand, a lot of different brands. And you can see they literally give you a green or a red for if it's no concern for heavy metals, some concern, moderate, or high concern. Across the board, some of these spices were worse than others. So like basil was really problematic. Some of the cumins were problematic. Ginger was really problematic. Oregano was problematic for really every brand. Some of your paprikas, thyme, some turmerics. So they give a full report as to what brands were safe within limits and what were not. I would just be mindful here of using dried herbs and spices. I personally really try to use the fresh because not only does it decrease the amount of heavy metals because it's not as concentrated, it also is going to have more bioactive compounds versus like something that's been dried, who knows how long it's been sitting in the spice container, right? So just be mindful with this and then check out that report because it does help guide you with some of the brands that might be the safest to start with. Across the board, Simply Organic was probably one of the better ones that was available. They also have a report on dark chocolate brands and the amount of lead and cadmium that's in dark chocolate. We're going to talk about cadmium in a second, but this is one that's really problematic for the thyroid. So this is really important. And there's some brands that were really high that you actually might be surprised by. Like I think the one when I shared this on Instagram, I believe it was last year, that got people was Hue brand. And that was one that came back high. So did Lily's, which you're like, oh, wait, I thought those were some of the best brands. Well, they might seem the best because they're organic and they do their good marketing, but it doesn't mean that they're not high in heavy metals. So, like Lily's, for example, was met over 144% of the lead content that's safe, and Hue was 210% above the limit. So, really problematic, and it's likely just because the more cacao that's in them, the more concentrated these components are, right? Because if you think of something like milk chocolate's not really chocolate. It's not really cacao. It's mostly sugar and milk. So the heavy metal content is going to drop because you don't find heavy metals in sugar and milk, or not very many. Whereas with dark chocolate, you've got a lot higher concentration of cacao, and that concentration is going to increase the heavy metal content. Same thing happens with like cacao powders and some of those other types of issues. So, how do these heavy metals show up in our symptoms? Well, when it comes to the endocrine system, sometimes when someone's having these really resistant hormone issues like hypothyroidism or Hashimoto's, PCOS, infertility, then we want to test for this because it could be one of the root causes that has been overlooked in terms of why your hormones aren't improving. Especially if like you've gotten testing done, your hormones look good, not because, remember, as I said, heavy metals aren't impacting your actual hormone levels. They're impacting how those hormones actually work on the different organs that we need them to. And so that's not something you can pick up through hormone testing. And that's where heavy metals come into the mix. On a day-to-day basis, symptoms might include things like hair loss. This is very common, abdominal pain, chills or low body temperature, dehydration, nausea or vomiting, numbness in your hands or feet. These are more symptoms of like severe heavy metal toxicity. Most people don't run into them. What I typically see in practice is more issues with the hormone signaling, as well as things like hair loss is a super common one. And then cognitive issues like brain fog, headaches, things of that sort. So that's where we typically see it show up for our clients. Now, just kind of like getting into some of the research on these heavy metals and the thyroid more specifically, there was a study that was done in Iran that looked at the levels of heavy metals like lead, cadmium, and chromium. And what they found was that higher levels of these heavy metals increase the risk of both hypothyroidism and thyroid cancer. And they found that mercury in particular can trigger autoimmune reactions like Hashimoto's and can cause an increase in oxidative stress. And oxidative stress is really what drives inflammation. Inflammation causes a lot of other host of problems in the way that our cells function, and can ultimately lead to things like thyroid cancer, autoimmune, hypothyroidism, things of that sort. They also looked at cadmium, and they found that environmental heavy metal exposure of cadmium also posed a particular risk to thyroid problems. And the reason they found this is because cadmium is especially known to disrupt thyroid hormone secretion, so the amount of thyroid hormones that are released. So not just functioning as an endocrine disruptor, but also acting on how much of these thyroid hormones are actually released into the body. And it also disrupts the conversion of T4 over to the active T3. If you're not familiar with the different components within thyroid hormones, 2 weeks ago in my last LOdown with Lo, I talk about what you should know about a thyroid panel and all the different hormones involved in the thyroid panel. And we talk about how T3 is the thyroid hormone we really care about. That's the one that's what we call biologically active. So we see with cadmium that it actually affects the levels of that active thyroid hormone T3. Manganese, which is a mineral that's not really a toxic, it's not really something that is like ever in toxic quantities, but if it was overconsumed, they also found that it can affect thyroid stimulating hormone levels, which is that TSH, which again we talk about in our last episode, is what comes from the brain and signals down to the thyroid to secrete thyroid hormones. So cadmium, manganese, mercury, all of these can be really problematic for the thyroid hormone. Now, how do we find out if heavy metals are an issue? Well, sometimes we can go by symptoms, but heavy metals are one of those tricky things to identify because a lot of the symptoms can look very similar to other things. Like brain fog and headaches could also be something else driving inflammation or a hormone imbalance. Again, like I mentioned, a lot of these heavy metals work by causing endocrine disruption, and we can't really pick that up through testing. We can't see in lab testing how those hormones are getting to the receptors. So, what we want to do instead is actually test for the levels of these heavy metals. And there's a few different ways that you can test. You might have heard of before what's called a hair tissue mineral analysis. And this is testing the hair, but we can also test your heavy metals in urine and blood. And they each pose their different benefits, really dependent off of what we're trying to look at. So for arsenic, for example, this has a half-life of about 3 to 4 hours in the blood. Essentially, this means that unless you are trying to identify that you were just exposed to arsenic, which I don't think is really helpful, unless you're like trying to form a lawsuit of like somewhere that you just were, then I don't think that that's really the way to go in terms of testing this. It really is going to be better to test in the hair because even in the urine, you can only detect arsenic for about 2 to 4 days. In the hair, we can detect it for about 6 to 12 months. So it gives us more insight into long-term exposure. And that's where we can really look at is like, okay, what have you been eating commonly in the last 6 to 12 months? Where have you been exposed? What kind of products have you been using, right? Whereas lead, for example, a blood test is what's commonly used for it. And lead can be detected for up to 1 to 2 months. So this might pose a little bit of a better option. You can also test for lead in hair too, but if you are going to test in blood, you get a little bit better long-term information. Cadmium, which, like I mentioned, is really important for thyroid hormones, has a half life in blood of about 3 to 4 months. So, again, we're getting warmer with testing in blood and that being a fine option. However, it has a significant half life of about 30 years in the body. So, if we have excess of cadmium, it can affect our cellular function for 30 years. That's crazy. It's just like mold, it impacts us for a very long time. And that's why sometimes these symptoms don't show up for many, many years of buildup happening. But it also, because of this long half life, you really could pick any mode of testing. Like you could test in hair, you could test in urine, you could even test your nails for levels of these because it's in the body for so long that you're going to get information from each of these sources. Metallic and elemental mercury has a quick half-life of about 3 days in the blood. Blood testing is very common for mercury, and this is what I commonly find happens if you go get like testing done at your doctor. Is they typically do it in blood. They don't generally have any other routes for testing unless it's a functional doctor that you're working with. But you can test in urine, and that will give us a little bit of insight closer to about 1 to 3 months, so a little bit longer. And then if you test in blood, or hair samples, you get about 40 to 90 days of exposure. So I really prefer to test in hair or urine because of this. It really gives us the most insight into all this information. But if for some reason you're trying to get more of an acute exposure, then blood would probably be the way to go. If we're trying to get more long term, how these things have been affecting you, how things have been building, then typically hair or urine is going to be most ideal for that. And generally, you're also going to find a higher concentration of them. Generally, these levels are going to be about 200 to 300 times more potent in the urine because they've just been concentrating for a longer period of time. So that's where working with a practitioner who can really hear your story, hear your symptoms, what's been going on, and then they can determine what the right testing is for you. At Functional Feeling, we have all of those modes of testing at our disposal, and we really do all three of them depending off of what we feel is going to gather us the most important information. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about treatment now that we maybe know that you have high levels of these heavy metals, which I want to just mention too that this is extremely common. Like, I would say that of the clients that we test for heavy metals that we suspect it's an issue, 9 out of 10 of them come back elevated, and not just for one, for several. Usually it's two to three heavy metals are coming back above range, like way above chart, even if they're mindful of these things, even if they are purchasing like the already tested proteins and things of that sort. And that's why what I'm going to talk about as it relates to treatment is so incredibly important, because like I mentioned, these things are ubiquitous and we really need to be doing some element of this type of support on a day-to-day basis to keep these heavy metal levels under control. If you get testing done and it comes back really high, then we need to push this even harder. But just on a day-to-day basis, I think it's good to have some of this in place. Before I get into that too, I wanted to mention something about protein powders, because this is another really problematic area. I mentioned earlier about brown rice powders, but there was a report that was done. It was back in 2018, I believe it was. Yeah, that was called the Clean Label Project, and they independently tested a bunch of different common protein powders. And what they found was that 70% of all of the protein powders that they tested high for detectable levels of lead, 74% tested high for detectable levels of cadmium, and 55% detected high for levels of BPA, which is that plastic like compound that also functions as an endocrine disruptor. 134 of the top selling protein powders and the Amazon bestseller list were tested in this report. So it was common brands that people are using every day that I commonly see in practice. And they found that in the organic protein powders, this is where things were actually the most problematic. So, like, for example, with cadmium and the organic brands, there was up to 4.8 times more. And I'm a fan of organic. I think the less we can get, herbicides and things into our system, the better. But I just want to mention this because I think it's important. A lot of times people think that if, you just buy organic, you limit all of these issues. And that's not necessarily the case. It doesn't necessarily avoid these heavy metals. Sometimes it actually makes it worse. And of all of these brands tested, the products that actually contained egg as their protein source tested the cleanest. And so this is one of the reasons why I am a huge fan of using animal-based protein powders, because animal-based protein powders don't have heavy metals in them. Even if you are plant-based, there are brands that do test for heavy metals, and I would make sure that you are getting those. You can ask for the report. I believe Truvani is one of them that has a report on their website. You can email them. They'll give you their heavy metal report. They have to get these things done. And you just want to look for a brand that is testing for these things. If you are open to using a non-plant-based protein powder, that's the way that I would go, because not only are these better from like a muscle recovery standpoint, because they have all of your amino acids in them, which is essential for being able to build lean muscle mass, but they also are lower in heavy metals. So it really is a win-win in my opinion. And the best ones really that I believe to be the best options on the market are either bone broth based or egg based, because they're going to have a really high bioavailability of those amino acids for best absorption, and they're going to be the lowest in heavy metals. So that's just something to think about when you are purchasing your protein powders. And you can do the same thing when you're purchasing herbs or like plant extracts. Look for companies that are testing for heavy metals. If they don't say that they are and they're not open about providing a report, they probably aren't. Generally, they do cost more because they have to pay for these things to get them tested, but it really is worth it because we want to be thinking about supplements we're taking. We don't want to just be focused on eating the best foods for us, but also thinking about what are the supplements that are going into us. And supplements are way more concentrated than food. So sometimes these can be even more problematic than the food sources. Or on the opposite end, they can even be more potent in terms of their medicinal benefit if they are the best quality. Okay, getting back to treatment. So, first and foremost, whenever we're talking about endocrine disruptors or any of these environmental compounds, the first place we want to start is avoidance. So, just becoming mindful of some of these sources, trying to limit them. You don't need to avoid them like the plague, but just being careful with them. And if you are going to consume a larger quantity, then maybe try to add in one of these measures I'm going to tell you about that you can do to help offset it. So, like, for example, in my earlier years, I used to eat a lot of rice because it was like a good so I thought, good complex carbohydrate source. And we see a lot of clients who eat a lot of rice too. And then I learned about heavy metals. I got my heavy metal levels tested. And I was like, ooh, this is not great. So I don't really eat rice anymore. Every so often, if I'm like at a restaurant and that's the starch source, I'll have it. And it's not about the carbohydrate content for me. It's just that I'm trying to keep my heavy metal levels in check. And it's not really worth it. I'd rather get like another starch source if they have the option that's going to be lower in heavy metals. So that's something. Your seafoods as well. So again, like if you are going to buy things like tuna, look for companies that are testing for mercury. There's a company called Safe Catch that I typically recommend to our clients. They do test for mercury. It's the lowest on the market if you are wanting to do tuna cans. Otherwise, stick to the acronym SMASH that stands for sardines, mackerel, anchovy, salmon, and herring. They're small fish, which means they have small amounts of mercury in them. They have virtually none. So you could, I feel, safely eat these multiple times per week and not run into an issue of mercury toxicity. But if you are someone that is eating a lot of white fish, if you are eating a lot of big fish, if you eat sushi a lot, you need to be really cautious with these things, because I have seen individuals that eat a lot of seafood with very high mercury levels that are impacting their reproductive hormones. Filtering your water. Water not only is a big source of other endocrine disrupting chemicals, it's a big source of heavy metals as well. Some cities, counties are worse than others, especially if you live on a well. Then you probably know that wells are very high in heavy metals, and that's generally why they have softeners and things that are incorporated. My parents, they have property and they have a well that's their water source. And I was taking a shower and I was taking a bath when I was up there last, and it smelled so bad. And so I told my parents, my mom's like, oh yeah, that's just what it smells like. It's well water. And so I took another bath and I was like, Mom, I really don't think this is good. Like the water was white, it was clear, but it just felt off. And so I had my dad pull out, he has a heavy metal, it's like a monitor that tests for heavy metals, and it came back at like 50 times the level that it should have been. And so I was like, see, I told you guys, you need to get this under control. So what they found was that the filtration on their well was only filtering to like one of their water hookups, and the bathtub I was taking the bath in, it wasn't. And so of course it was just 2 baths I took. It's not going to kill me, but it was just something that I thought was interesting. And so we actually went down to the river and tested the water in the river, and it was significantly less. It was like as safe as drinking water. And I was like, of course, I took a bath in 50 times worse water than what is actually in the stream of the river. So this is just something to think about, especially if you do live like in a county or on a well. But even in municipal, like city water, I mean, like LA is the worst. And you can actually, if you go to the ewg.org, they have a clean water database, and you can put in your zip code and it'll actually tell you like what is in your water. And it's really scary when you see these things. And then based off of what is found in there, that's the type of water filter that I would purchase, because it's going to filter out the most of these. So filtering your water is huge. I use a Berkey and I have an additional fluoride filter on it because I really want to be mindful of fluoride. Fluoride is also another problematic element that we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks that can be really problematic for the thyroid as well. And so I try to filter out as much of it as possible. Check your supplements. If you're taking something quite a bit, if you're taking a lot of it, if you're taking it consistently, make sure you're buying it from reputable brands that are third-party tested, that are testing for heavy metal concentrations. If you're one of our clients and you're purchasing anything through our professional grade supplement dispensary, these have all been tested and they're the highest quality standards. But if you are not a client, or you're using something that is not from a third-party tested company, I would definitely look into this. We definitely want to make sure that we also have adequate antioxidants and B vitamins, because these are going to actually help to be able to prevent the toxicity that comes from heavy metals. So, for example, vitamin C, vitamin B1, B6, they've all been reported to enhance the sensitivity of both cadmium and lead toxicity. So if there's deficiency in any of those, then we typically end up with more issues with these heavy metals. Vitamin C and E are both really potent antioxidants, and they're really important for helping combat free radical damage and help decrease oxidative stress. And B vitamins help decrease lead levels in places like our lead, kidneys, in our liver, kidneys, bone, and blood. So we want to just make sure we have adequate antioxidants in our diet through supplementation, especially if we're getting these things tested, they're coming back low. It probably means that that it might want to investigate heavy metals further, because your body might be depleting reserves, trying to use what's in the body to be able to help combat some of the harmful effects of these. Our body's always going to use its resources first, right? So if you're like getting your vitamin C levels tested and they come back low and you eat quite a bit of plants in your diet, I definitely would have some suspicion that there's something your body is using all that vitamin C for, and this could explain it. Outside of that, chelators are a type of herb that's really important. Chelators are things like parsley, chlorella, cilantro. Those are some of my favorites. They're chelators, which means that they actually bind to the heavy metals and help pull them out of our body. So, for example, if you're going to have like a big bowl of rice, could you add to it one of these herbs to provide some of that chelation effect? Fiber is really great for this too. Fiber is great for really removing every type of toxin from the body because it helps pull things out our gut, which is how our body detoxifies everything that goes through the liver. So fiber in general, eating adequate plants. I know that's a little bit of a caveat because plants are also where a lot of these heavy metals are found, but there are safer plant sources, and just making sure that we're getting enough fiber, that we're going to the bathroom often, at least 1 to 2 times per day, that we're going poop, so that we can eliminate these heavy metals along with other things like hormones that are in excess, like estrogen and other endocrine disrupting chemicals. And then sauna or sweat is probably one of my other favorite tools. This is one of the reasons, amongst others, that I sauna, and we're going to have an upcoming podcast episode about all the benefits of sauna here in this season. It's coming up in the next few weeks. But sauna, when we sweat, that is actually one of the big compounds that we lose in our sweat. We lose minerals, we lose heavy metals, we of course lose electrolytes as well. But sauna is one of the best ways to be able to detoxify these heavy metals. And all of these things I'm mentioning are things you can do safely every single day. So you can like try to incorporate as many of these compounds on a daily basis. And then if you do come back high for heavy metals, then that's where we'd want to like really bolster down on specific protocols in terms of how frequently you're doing these things, for how long, how much of these compounds you're using, and then also looking at maybe adding in supplemental binders and things that can additionally help with removal of heavy metals so that we can get the body cleared out and get you back to your homeostasis again so that your hormones can restore to their most healthy place. So I hope this episode was helpful for you guys. I would love if you love this episode to share it with a friend, share it on social, give us a rating in your podcast app. It really helps so much. Thank you guys so much for listening today, and we'll be back next week with another episode.